I landed a job with Roger Corman to do originally the job was to take a Russian science fiction picture that he had bought, and he wanted me to write the English dialogue for it. Of course, I didn't speak any Russian, and then I realized he didn't care whether I could understand what they were really saying, and I just wanted me to make up dialogue, and he wanted, the movie really was a very idealistic science fiction picture, and he wanted to add some monsters and kind of have the story be related to that. So I got that job, and I worked very hard on that, and then ultimately I became Roger's assistant. That meant I had to wash his car, and he'd have me work as a dialogue director in the morning on a Vincent Price movie, and of course they would pay my salary, but then I would leave at 1 and then go work on his stuff. So he would basically get me for for free. So the great thing about Roger was he exploited all of the young people who worked for him to the fullest, but at the same time, the other side of it was he really gave you responsibility and opportunity, so it was kind of a fair deal. Roger had a technique he would do is he would make a film paid for by usually AIP, American International Pictures, and he would put together the team and the equipment to make the film, and then usually he would, after it was over, make a second film because all of those expenses were already, he could get a real bargain on it. So Roger said he was going to make a film in Europe and asked me if I knew anyone who could be like the sound man on it. So I said, oh, I could, and of course I didn't know anything about, I was good with technology, but I had never done the sound. So I took the recorder home and read the instructions, and Roger did take me. And then about 3/4 through that film, which was called The Young Racers, 3/4 through that film, what happened was Roger was going to be called back to direct the film back home, which was The Raven with Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff. Well, I knew that he couldn't pass up a bargain to make another film while he was in Europe. So I said, Roger, I have a script that could be made, a kind of a psycho, because he always wanted a film that was like some hit film. Psycho was a big deal, Hitchcock, and so I said, I had this script and stuff, and he said, well, show me some of it. So I showed him, the 3 pages I wrote that night, and which was, of course, the most garish kind of action scene I could come up with, and he said, okay. And I went off, he gave me a check for $20,000. Yeah, he sent me with a young woman who had worked on the production who was going to be the co-signer. And I went to Ireland, and when I was in Ireland, I met another producer, and I said I was making a film for Roger, and this guy offered to buy the English rights for another $20,000. So I had now $40,000. But Roger, of course, expected to get his $20,000 back, still make the movie for the 20, which the English rights, and get the film for free. But I sort of just duped him. I just took both checks and I put it in the bank, and I had this young woman sign a check, and I just kind of made the amount for the whole amount. So she basically was out of the check signing. So then I made the movie for $40,000, which was this little black and white horror film called Dementia 13, which we made in about 9 days. In the professional world, much more unpleasant than I thought. And I was always feeling, gee, I wish I could get the enthusiasm back when I was doing shows at college. Maybe I was young and it was new to me, but it would just seem like so much fun, and you could almost didn't want to go home, or you'd come back late at night and do some more work on it and stuff. And I always found the film world unpleasant and kind of all about the schedule, and it sort of never really flew for me in the way that this very happy college career did. So, I would have to say that the happiest days for me that I can remember is like when The Godfather was over and I didn't have to go there anymore, when Apocalypse was over, when finally, Godfather was a very appreciated movie when we were making it. They were very unhappy with it. They didn't like the casting. They didn't like the way I was shooting it. I was always really on the verge of getting fired, so it was extremely nightmarish experience. I had 2 little kids, and a third one was born during that, and we lived in a little apartment, and I was basically frightened that that they didn't like it, and I was, they as much as said it that. So when it was all over, I wasn't at all confident that it was going to be successful. I'd never ever get another job. So I took a job. They needed someone and very quickly to write a version of The Great Gatsby for the movie they're making. So I took this job so I'd be sure to have some dough to support my family. And I went off, and I don't know why I was in Paris, but I was in Paris, like staying all up night writing this Gatsby script, and that's when The Godfather opened. It was this enormous success, So I would just get a phone call on and say, "Oh yeah, it's going great. Everyone loves it." I said, "Oh yeah, really? Oh, I can't get this script done, And it's ironic that probably the greatest moment of my career, certainly that I was about 32 or so, making The Godfather, having such a enormous success, wasn't even one that I even was aware of because I was somewhere else and I was, again under the deadline. So I don't have. Certainly, it was a wonderful night when we won all those Oscars for Godfather 2, because that wasn't, at first that picture came out and people really didn't like it too much. But I have to be honest that I associate my motion picture career more with being unhappy and being scared or being in trouble or being under the gun, and not at all with anything pleasant. Courage, I think, because I don't think there's any artist of any value who doesn't doubt what they're doing. And I would say, in looking back on my life, that the things that I got in the most trouble for, or that I was fired for, I wrote the script of Patton, and the script was very controversial when I wrote it because they thought it was so stylized. It was supposed to be like a sort of, The Longest Day. And my script of Patton, was sort of interested in reincarnation. And I had this very bizarre opening where he stands up in front of an American flag, gives a speech. And ultimately, I wasn't fired, but I was fired, meaning that when the script was done, I said, "Okay, thank you very much," and they went and hired another writer, and that script was forgotten. And I remember very vividly this long kind of being raked over the coals for this opening scene. My point is that what I've learned is that the stuff that I got in trouble for, the casting for The Godfather or the flag scene in Patton, was the stuff that was remembered and was considered really the good work. So what that tells you is that in your own time, usually the stuff that's your best idea or work is going to be attacked the most ferociously, probably because it's new or because they had never seen an opening of a movie like that, or seen a gangster movie done in the style. So you have to really be courageous about your instincts and your ideas, because otherwise you'll just knuckle under and change it, and then things that might have been memorable will be lost. Other things, obviously, a lot of energy and enthusiasm, of course, because this kind of work it really is grueling, many, many hours, and you're sort of in a lot of uncomfortable situations. And so, enthusiasm, courage, energy, kind of trying to stick to whatever your idea was in a profession which absolutely everybody is telling you their opinion, which is different. The grips will tell you that you don't know what you're doing, or the camera operator or the cameraman, everybody. When you go on a set, that's one of the reasons George Lucas never directed again. No one knows this, but when he made Star Wars over there in England, George is sort of a little skinny version of me, and he's doesn't have the most physical kind of stamina, and he was so ridiculed and sort of, that kind of jock-like attitude that crews can have, putting him down for what he was doing and stuff. He was so unhappy making Star Wars that he just vowed he'd never do it again. And plus he was like diabetic, so he was a little sick, and that you really have to. That's why someone today said you ought to love what you're doing, because, especially in a movie, you really have to love the project and love the story, because you will over the time you really will start to hate it, and the fact that you say, gee, but I really like what this is about, is a very valuable asset. Our generation represented a major transition. It was the first time, certainly, that film students uh, were given the chance to make films. Film in the past was it was a profession that you kind of worked your way up. Frank Capra was a prop man. I think John Ford was a prop man, and it was a little bit of a father and son thing, and you kind of worked your way up. And when we all went to film school, my class and my comrades there, we didn't think we were ever going to really get to make feature films. We thought we would end up making industrial films, or, possibly, some be on the fringe, or maybe get involved in television. My aspirations when I went, I had no idea. I mean, I just wanted to be part of the film business. I had no idea that I'd really get to direct feature films or to be successful at it. And of course, my story is that when I was going for my graduate degree, I decided I was going to make a feature film as my thesis. That's what I was famous for, was that I was not only the first film student to kind of become a professional director, but I also had my thesis film be a feature film, which was You're a Big Boy Now. So once I broke in, I was the first one to break in, and I always loved the kind of theater-like feeling of working together. I mean, that's ultimately what I was probably trying to achieve in my life, because I had been a kid that moved so much. I didn't have a lot of friends, so theater really represented that kind of camaraderie. So a lot of younger would-be film directors started to come and hang out, because I had an office at Warner Brothers. I had directed Finian's Rainbow when I was 23 or something. And pretty soon all these kids, some of them my age, some of them a little younger, started hanging around out with me, and I had a little money, and I had a lot of ambition to set up a group, a company. And so that's when I met George Lucas, of course, who was younger, and then he had all of his friends, and ultimately it became kind of this gang of young filmmakers who really were friends and hung around together. The key thing about film students at that point is we all wanted to work in 35 millimeter, and film students were junkies for equipment. And so suddenly I had penetrated the Hollywood studio, and due to a very funny circumstances, which is that the company I was with, which was Seven Arts, had bought Warner Brothers. So for a while, no one knew who was running it. So I sort of just had the keys of the whole studio, and it was as though we suddenly had Warner Brothers, and we walked around and talked about, we're going to get animation going again. And before I know it, there were all these guys coming there, and we'd talk about it. And that's when I met people like Carol Ballard and George Lucas and John Milius and Phil Kaufman, I remember, and Brian De Palma, and later Marty Scorsese. They were all a few years younger, and they, then we really decided we were going to be independent. We were all going to move to San Francisco, and we did. And that company, produced some of those people's first films, George's films and what have you. And ultimately, but I had always wanted to be part of that type of artistic scene, like you hear about in Paris. What might it have been like to be there? And there's Hemingway in the Ritz Bar, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, or Sartre, and these wonderful people. And when we were there broke, trying to figure out how to pay for anything, little did I realize that in effect that's what that was, that all those people were to go on and become wonderful artists and stuff. But then it just seemed like we were just a bunch of young people who were wanted to take over the movie business. And in a way we did, but in a way we didn't, because we really wanted better things for it than what really happened. Well, I was a child right at the end of the Second World War, during the Second World War, and my father was a musician, and for that reason, he would come home from New York. He was always interested in the new things, so he did bring a television home. I remember really right around 1945. So I remember sort of I was about 6, so I remember growing up with television from the time when it was just a test pattern and maybe a little bit of programming once in a while. So, and then when I was about 9, I had polio, and one of the conditions of polio was, of course, people were very frightened for their children, so you tended, if you had it, to be isolated. So there was about a year and a half when I stayed at home. I was paralyzed for a while, and so I basically watched television and listened to the radio and played with a tape recorder and puppets, and kind of my day was made up of those kinds of things. I had a number of very strong personalities in my family. Of course, my father was a concert flutist. He was the solo flute for Toscanini, and that was a very, kind of unusual profession for a kid to have as his father, because he would dress up in tuxedo, and I would see him. My earliest memories are of his practice, because a concert musician has to practice a lot, and I remember that. And also he was really, he was a great musician, very knowledgeable, and he used to, tell us the stories about the operas and about the composers. So he did have a lot of knowledge that he would, he would make it a point of telling us about. And then I had an older brother who was 5 years older than me, who was a very successful student, very handsome kid. And being my older brother of that many years was really, like an edge that I had, because, I had an older brother and who would protect me. But he was a very sensitive and talented boy, and he became interested in literature. So at the same time that I had all this information from my father, I also had a brother who was giving me books at a young age that, I would normally not run into. I was, reading as a kid books like, certainly Brave New World, of course, which was fun because it was sort of science fiction. But I remember he was showing me James Joyce and Andre Gide and stuff like that. So, I was really stimulated at an age younger than normally I would come into exposure, that kind of thing. I think a book I would put in that category that I read when I was quite young, I don't even know, it was around the house and I picked it up and read it, was a play, actually, Streetcar Named Desire, that I read, when I was like 15 or so. And I just thought it was so beautiful and moving, even though I'm not even sure I understood, but the language, just the pictures that painted when you read it. And I liked reading plays. I think I preferred almost reading plays to novels or other kinds of books. I also liked reading biography of scientists. That was a favorite thing of mine. And when I was younger, and I think I could read quite young because I have memory of reading the fairy tales. I remember being in kindergarten, I could read them because used to be my job to tell them to the other kids. So I very much liked fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen, Grimm fairy tale, all the classic fairy tales. I was interested in two things always. One was science and the stories of the scientists and scientific experimentation. I liked very much to work in shop down in the basement and then try to invent things and build gadgets. And at the same time, I was interested in stories. And I had an older brother who was very interested in literature, and so I had an early exposure to literature and what have you. But ultimately, in theater, my father sometimes would work in musical comedies, or I would have the opportunity to see musical comedies. And ultimately, those different technical and sort of story interests around high school or early high school, I started to do the lighting, work on the lighting of the drama productions and be around the shows. And so I started to become interested in theater, and I thought I wanted to be a playwright because I was interested in stories and telling stories. Well, I was college student, I had enrolled in the drama department, and my father was not very pleased with that because they wanted me to take some more practical kind of profession, engineering or something, because I did have ability in science, and but I won a playwriting scholarship to Hofstra, what was then Hofstra College, now Hofstra University, and I was very much immersed in the theater production and started to direct theater. And one afternoon, I remember around 4 o'clock in a building called the Little Theater, I noticed a notice that they were going to show a film called 10 Days That Shook the World by Eisenstein. And I went in to see it. It was pretty long, and there were only 2 or 3 other people. But I was so impressed with this film, and it was a silent film, but so impressed with what cinema could do, and of course having quite a bit of experience in theater. But at that afternoon, I think, was when I decided that I would not go into theater. And for me, the specific decision was whether I was going to go to the Yale Drama School or UCLA. And so at that point, I decided I was going to go into movies. And even my last year or 2 years at college, I was always trying to get like a cinema workshop or get to make a little film. Or I think one summer I actually tried to make a film. And then when I was graduated in 1960, then I went to UCLA and went to their graduate film school program. It combines so many other art forms, as does theater and opera, but it's the essence of cinema, of course, I guess, is editing. So it's the combination of what can be extraordinary images, images of people during moments, emotional moments, or also just images in a general sense, but then put together in a kind of alchemy of in which maybe a number of images put together a certain way become something, quite above and beyond what any of them are. And this of course was one of the elements of the Eisenstein film that was so exciting, was that how the editing was able to take, that's always fascinating, take this and put it together and have something come out that was neither of those two things. And of course the sense of rhythm that editing can do. Even I was struck, I remember on 10 Days That Shook the World, how although it was a silent film, there were sequences where you actually almost could hear the machine guns firing because of the way it was edited. So it's a form of alchemy, of magic that is very appealing. I think cinema, movies, and magic have always been closely associated because the very earliest people who made film were magicians, and one of the aspects of it was the idea of an illusion, a magical illusion in the early days of movies. A lot of early magicians began experimenting with using basically what is cinema to do their illusions. And of course we know that some of the early pioneers like Méliès and what have you were magicians and used cinema to create illusion. So it was a little bit, I think cinema always had, as did theater for me, this ability to create some kind of magic, either through lighting, but to use technology to create magic is what appealed to me, I think. I had a number of teachers who hated me, at least I felt. I was not, I didn't do well in school. I did very well in school my first year and a half, and we left that school. I really quite liked that first school I went to, and life for me at age 5 and 6 was pretty wonderful and perfect. But then I went to a number of other schools. I went to many schools and went through that whole New York school system, PS this and PS that, and I found them very frightening and like penitentiaries, and I didn't do well in those schools, maybe partly because I was always moving from school to school, but nonetheless I do remember teachers who really singled me out for their discouragement. And in fact, I had a very sort of heartbreaking experience because when as I said, when I was 9, I always wanted to be a guard, because I was a new kid in the school. Guard was, in those schools, wore a yellow button that said guard, and they would be a hall guard or a stair guard or whatever they were. And the girl that I thought was the most wonderful girl in the world was a guard, I remember. And when I got polio, of course, I was taken out of school, and then about a year and a half later, I went back to school, and as they had a little ceremony and kind of welcomed me back, and they made me a guard as part of I guess my being taken back into school. And my teacher, Mrs. Hemashandra, who really was. I think she was a very bright woman, but I remember her as an oppressor. But I remember like a week later, she said, "Well, why should you be a guard just because you were sick?" And she took away my guard button, So, no, I didn't have any teachers who were especially encouraging to me until much later, until high school. And in high school, there was a particular science teacher that thought I had a lot of ability because I had a natural talent with scientific things. And I was, for some reason, I was bad in all my subjects, but I was very good at geometry. And I was amazing. I had, among the highest grade in geometry in the school. And so, I mean, I was, I didn't realize it then, but I guess I was a kind of, a kid that maybe had some talents or ability, but never came out in any school. And it was only later in high school, in my senior year, I had a creative writing teacher, and maybe there was a writing teacher in college that was very encouraging to me to do writing. Of course, later, when I was a graduate student, I had a wonderful teacher. I admired a woman director, one of the only, in fact, the only Hollywood woman director, and her name was Dorothy Arzner. And she was very, very encouraging to me, and at a time when I could use encouragement. So I remember her very favorably. In those days, I was an extremely energetic and enthusiastic person, and I just loved to be involved in all of, movie making was to me almost like my private passion, because it wasn't as, widespread. When I started the Hofstra Cinema Club, I think 2 people came, so people weren't as fascinated with cinema as they are now. And at UCLA, I guess I was, again, being a theater student, I was a little frustrated because theater students are very gregarious, and you all work together and stay up all night and make sets and do shows. And cinema students in those days at UCLA, where the cinema department was in these kind of army barracks, and it was pretty much all guys. I think there was maybe one girl in the entire department, which was, very discouraging. I mean, it wasn't as nice to be in a place where there were no girls going to school with you, and so I very much wanted to do it all the time, and UCLA wasn't like that. They'd work on their project and they'd be in their room editing for 6 months. There was a whole crowd of young actors who used to be in a lot of those early inexpensive films. Jack Nicholson, Luana Anders, and Jonathan Hale. It was a whole group. I think Jack pretty much is the only really well-known one. And then later years, after I had gone through there, Roger gave similar opportunities to Peter Bogdanovich, Marty Scorsese, Jonathan Demme. So, he basically was always looking for the very energetic person who would work for next to nothing and had some talent, hopefully. We were raised in an Italian-American household, which meant that my father was a musician, so we were very proud of being Italian. We ate pizza when no one knew what pizza was, really, and, Italian food, and had Italian music, although we didn't speak Italian in the house. But I always remember my mother would say to me, "Oh, but," she says, "America is the greatest country in the world." And there was a sense, even as, kind of Italian Americans, but there was a sense that America was a great privilege to live in America and be Americans. And most Italians who came to this country are very patriotic, and what that meant was just that there was this exciting possibility that if you worked real hard and you loved something, that you could become successful. and wouldn't be held down, due to who your family was and what have you. And, certainly in my case, I found that to be true. I became, quite successful very young, and it was mainly because I would have to say it's because I was so enthusiastic and I just worked so hard at it.